Hello everyone, today a video response to Matt Easton's scholagladiatoria's channel regarding his last video at this point. Why didn't medieval longbowmen switch to recurved bows? Right, in the thumbnail you can read why longbows if recurves are better. So I'm not really a champion in explaining things in 30 seconds because also there is a lot to unpack here. I wanted to first of all point out that Matt Easton is one of the few YouTube creators in the field of mostly HEMA, that he invented himself as a term. So we're talking historical European martial art. In this case, actually, the thing expands evidently, as we will see on Asia and beyond. He definitely knows how to run a YouTube channel. I'm not trying to make this video response to get more views than I usually do. As you know, I make lots of videos and very few of them are actually video commentaries responses. But this was properly a question that he launched to the broader audience. I may take on some antagonistic critical stance here just because, I will speak out loud whatever, say, here it needs to be addressed. But again, I wanted to stress that regardless also of any, again, political background, relation with other YouTubers, whatever, I respect the guy, and I was curious, in fact, enough to watch one of his videos lately, which I normally sort of never do for anyone. So not that he has to feel flattered if he ever watches this video response. There is really a lot here to discuss because the topic is not merely technical in terms of weapons performance, it's also tactical in terms of doctrinal application and strategical, if not beyond, given that we're talking at some point about armies comparisons. I would like to make this first criticism. That's one of the reasons why I actually discuss channels like this, which I, specifically as far as HEMA is concerned, I hardly ever do, not because I wouldn't have something, actually a lot to say. So I have to decide myself to make a video about my extremely negative experience with HEMA, but also I put into it reenactment, whatever. I know there are different things, very wildly differing ones, really. But as you know, I focus on the art of war. I specialize in tactical reconstruction, properly through primary sources, as you have also partially seen in some of my videos, properly reconstruct battles and literally how the armies function in that, which obviously informs the sort of individual perspective that I must unfortunately say, HEMAists here, I'm not necessarily talking about Matt Easton, but we'll talk about this also now, mostly seemingly stop to, right? When we're talking about context, Easton is very big about context, and reasonably so, also because I think he has a solid professional background, I think in archaeology, besides his, HEMA school, tend to sort of miss the broader context, as a matter of fact. The one of the art of war, a diachronic and comparative analysis study of tactics, strategy, armaments as well. And I say this with a note of bitterness because, as you can notice, HEMA channels are, at least at large, fairly successful. At least it seems to me that most people approaching medieval warfare, historically speaking, tend to pass through these specific channels, right? I know that there are big channels like Kings and Generals, Saint Roman, etc., that tend to make sort of warfare at a higher level of scale, at least thematically speaking. However, those do not even begin to scratch the surface of the subject matter. We often criticize their work as well, as far as, do we want to really explain how things work? Because we actually know. And it seems to me that, therefore, topics like this are the tip of the iceberg for, in fact, some much greater insight of medieval warfare. And in my humble sort of doctoral background in the medieval art of war, I think that I can bring something to the table of discussion, as I hope to do. So basically, I will summarize the first part of Easton's video because I largely agree with what it says. I will analyze then verbatim the last half, which I take some issue, of course, in a friendly yet still critical manner. So the summary of Scholagladiatoria's video on European longbows versus composite recurve bows, the author explores why the video is like 20 minutes long, right? 23 minutes, something like that. Why European nations, particularly the English and the French, continued using the longbow despite the composite recurve bow's superior energy efficiency. And now we will explain also better what he means by that, because basically Easton is looking at the composite bow, and admittedly, these are big topics, right? And naturally, he discusses them a lot on his channel, so any sort of further introduction he can afford to skip in general. And he's basically evaluating, in essentially ergonomic terms, the absolute performance of these types of bows, the sort of European self-wooden bow, and the here it was also European in part, but also mostly Asian steppe, right, originating composite bow of essentially the later Middle Ages, right? And he especially measures this on essentially velocity, speed of the arrows, and range, right? So there is a point, the most contentious, that is countering the notion, which is actually the first one that pops up when you just hear the question in and of itself. That is to say, basically, it didn't matter that apparently longbow was used with some kind of heavier projectile and tended to be, even just structurally, you can see it sort of bulkier and in this sense also more, let's say, more resistant to a particular type of stress. I will talk about the latter thing also in relatively technical terms. I will not give you immediately the technical answer, that is to say there is probably a dimension at especially a shorter range where, in the sense, the longbow, if properly armed, is more performing than the composite recurve bow. And let's see how Easton descends into the topic by degree to get essentially what his question is actually about, because the topic is huge, but he's narrowing it down to a very specific aspect of the wall, and or leading us there, because that's sort of the immediate response that I had in mind even before watching the video. So he begins by acknowledging the longbow's battlefield success in late medieval Europe. I would like also to make a bit of sponsor here on my own work, given that I made multiple videos exactly on these topics. As you know, also last spring I made an entire series about the English tactics of the 100 Years' War. We essentially pointed out the actually non-exceptionalistic profile the same, meaning that contrary to what can be a more narrowed down sort of English only perspective, and that's where the diachronic and comparative aspects of the art of war is really important. And this, unfortunately, is not much out there, because people do not study other countries, do not at least have a clear, sort of more or less even comparative understanding of what is actually happening in terms of tactical quantities on the battlefields of Europe in a given centuries all across, right? They sort of eyeball that, but without much of a specific focus. Nevertheless, I have an entire playlist dedicated to medieval missile warfare and also properly archery, military archery. And of course, he mentions Crécy, Poitiers, Azincourt. But then Easton challenges the notion that the longbow was an inherently superior weapon to the composite recurve bow used roughly in Asia, say Middle East, also North Africa, etc. Key points. So the composite recurve bow's advantages. As listed in the video, composite recurve bows made of horn, sinew, and wood are more energy efficient, as we were saying before, ergonomic, capable of shooting arrows faster and farther than longbows, which is actually true, even at lower draw weights, such as 50 to 70 pounds libs versus longbow's higher draw weights, right? Easton points out that the composites are smaller, lighter, and easier to transport and store. He also just shows that with some of his replicas. and essentially making them ideal for both foot and mounted archery, which is also a fair point regarding, because here we are entering the I'm also summarizing in general, so he makes a more articulate sort of description, which I agree with. I have nothing to say about. We made so many videos about steps warfare, as well what we're talking about, if anything, from my own work as well. So here's the point. So apparently, naturally, this presentation of top ergonomy already sort of serves his general point, because he's the first one who talks about context, and so trying to provide a historical answer, obviously highlighting that was some advantage for which the longbow was used, in spite of this sort of apparently absolute, and so therefore non-relative, non-circumstantial, not contingential, not contextual ergonomy, absolute ergonomy. So why didn't Europe adopt composite bows? Availability, he says, while often cited, is a weak argument, because longbows were frequently made with imported wood, that is to say, for example, Italian or Spanish yew, and composite bow making technology existed in Europe, as evidenced by composite crossbow prods, by the way. Additionally, recurve bows could have been imported from regions like Hungary as well, where they were sort of more traditional because of essentially the westernmost part of the steppes, and many warriors still being settled from farther east by the Hungarian crown there. A little point about this. We'll see now further what this is all about. The notion, it's good to, of course, point out that the English longbow of the famed English armies, in fact, of the 100 Years' War, was in great part imported from foreign countries. For example, the aforementioned Italy, the Lombard, pre-alpine forested slopes that were particularly tempered by the local climate to confer the wood specific characteristics of elasticity and so on. The point, though, here, and of course he was not making the video about this and he knows better, but that they would like to stress here to, in fact, normalize. As I was saying before, there is an exceptionalistic notion here that he's also rhetorically framing the topic as. That is to say, he didn't make, of course, the point that longbow was used just in, northwestern Europe. He acknowledges, of course, that this existed in the West, firing wide. However, right, we should point out that in general, the longbow, it's important to remember, was there in Europe since prehistory. Not only that, but it had always been made in the same identical way. The entire sedentary Europe always used the same identical type of bow every freaking where. The simple wooden bow, the longbow being just sort of a bigger sized one that originally stemmed from simply like the normal adaptation of the weapon to the user's physique, right? And that, as we will see now, but I don't want to mix topics here, was also enhanced in that direction, in a tactical, doctrinal, we can so anachronistically use this term, in another more increasingly professional fashion, where this longbowmen were some kind of sort of scoliotic giants trained for a lifetime of warfare with this weapon. Another very interesting topic that I widely discussed in my videos is the fact of why, in general, the English seem to specialize themselves with the longbow, essentially amidst a sea of crossbow dominance that also was not basically crippled by the English victories of the 100 Years' War that still were fought within a sort of specifically national, binational, at least regional context. All right, so that's yet the other. He properly mentioned the crossbow for that matter. The point I want to make is that by the time we are discussing here, like the 14th, the 15th century mostly, Western European warfare in particular was incredibly homogeneous materially. Europeans had, like, for medieval standards, like some sort of industrial production level of commercial reach that made it kind of obvious at some point to buy particular material from different countries. Right here, we mentioned it. The Italians produced the longbow material. As any other European, like the Germans, the French, the Spanish, they had always used longbows themselves. There were plenty of evidence throughout all the Middle Ages that was the case, and not just by some sort of English influence. Yet they stuck, and these were literally the most advanced arms and armor manufacturing areas in the world, and the greatest in Europe, with a crossbow for a reason, right? And so I'm not going to open that Pandora box. If anything, we can discuss this for another time, but I would like to stress how sort of non-strange, of course, it is by this later medieval period to have weapons produced, sold, imported, assembled, etc., across most of Western Europe. All right, that was, as we will see, and this is also a bit like one of perhaps the biggest elephant in the room, had by far the most advanced warfare in Western Eurasia. But I will leave that for later, because there's a very specific and fundamental issue I will point out from this general discussion, right? Not necessarily from the video. Easton quite appropriately debunks the notion that composite bows were less durable in Europe's allegedly wetter climate. He points out that regions like Hungary, Mongolia, and India with extreme weather successfully witnessed the use of longbows. This is notorious, the entire sense that you think a medieval archer did not know how to keep his bowstrings dry during campaign just is directly proportional to the ignorance of the thinker there. In any case, there is this other point that starts being a bit more relevant: armor penetration. Longbows became prominent before heavy plate armor was widespread. On this, I actually disagree, importantly. I spent my decades studying sort of the medieval art of war, especially in Western Europe, but not only, by the way, and I must say that the development of sort of consistently large and sort of systemically trained professional longbowmen units definitely coincides with the spread of plate, right? We have, as I said before, a lot of evidence of use of longbow throughout right, in the West, in every single country, with also very prominent iconographical, archaeological evidence. So there's absolutely nothing strange about the use of the longbow in general. But one thing is, and this is part of some of the issues of how the thing was framed, is that we're not really looking at the weapon per se. We're looking at not much at an abstract context. We're literally looking at specific units in a specific time in medieval armies' development, right? And my best understanding that, again, I don't have to prove you how informed this is. In general, we can assess it. It witnesses the spread of longbow. We are, in fact, in the second half of the 13th century. It's not random, especially in England, which has some characteristics that, again, will single it out compared to other Western countries because of the preeminent use of bowmen that here are, of course, also tendentially longbowmen, especially as the more professional they become. This is the same identical moment in which plate armor starts spreading in a consistent fashion, which is also the same time in which, for example, the larger swords, the knightly ones, start passing from 1.5-handed to second-handed type, eminently for sort of anti-plate armor function. In parallel to that, you even have the end of what had historically been sort of the most defining quality of swords at that point, their cutting capacity. In later times, this thing, it's not like it ends, but the weapon focuses mostly on like this sort of bigger smashing capacity to properly destructure the plate mail assortment. Then you have, of course, other sort of secondary weapons that help sort of properly sticking into the the openings of the armor and so on. And this is basically something that is projected also at the level of cavalry becoming ever heavier, men-at-arms becoming ever more elite, and needing, in fact, secondary auxiliary forces ever more sort of specialized, a bit like the same weapons we see today. So I don't know where, because again, I don't watch Schola Gladiatoria that much, but again, I covered these topics from a long time on my own, and I don't understand here exactly why this chronological sort of mismatch, right? Longbows became prominent before heavy plate armor was widespread. What do we mean by that? Like full plate armor? Sure, but if we actually follow the development of armor, basically the affirmation of the longbow as some sort of more common and basically quantitatively, in this sense, also relatively dominant weapon in archer units is definitely in England in the second half of the 13th century. It's actually going in parallel with the affirmation of plate armor. And that's definitely not a coincidence, which is also actually backed by something that Easton said later. Understand, this was a short video. I am very picky and critical and annoying. I know that, but I think it's also important to answer the final question. Now, I'm sure that by reading the script, I could digress on other sort of interesting aspects, but here we get to the main point, and I will start reading directly the script only for this aspect, because this is exactly, I think, the point I disagree with, and I think that it also evolves in Easton's explanation in some sort of also more meaningful direction that can help contribute to the actual matter. Because he says, quote, "Now another argument that some people make, including me, I would say, is that longbows, especially in high draws, can shoot heavy arrows, which are really good at penetrating armor." So this is exactly the point that I would make in order to answer his question without, again, having heard the rest of what he's talking about. I will give some specifics, because of course Easton is not coming from nowhere with this. So let's say in this way, the longbow has higher draw weights, say 100 to 180 pounds even, and shoots heavier arrows, can shoot heavier arrows, and this does seem what was actually going on specifically in Western Europe in the specifically and also relatively homogeneous tactics that we will also further discuss later. So we're talking 80, 100 grams of arrows compared to the composite recurve bow, as we've seen, 60, 100 pounds, 40, 60 grams, because of its material properties, structural design, tactical response, which together enable it to deliver greater raw force, kinetic energy, and momentum at short range, 50, 100 meters. The longbow, typically made from a single piece of yew, uses the wood's dense heartwood compression and elastic sapwood tension to withstand extreme stress, allowing draw weights up to 180 pounds without breaking. Its long limbs, 6-7 feet, and deep draw, 28-32 inches, store more total energy, efficiently transferring it to heavy arrows, which maximize momentum, say 80-90 joules. We can discuss, of course, the figures, because we're not talking top performances, because, as you know, on the battlefield, things were different. It's all about the collective use. We'll talk about that later. But first, smashing through mail, or causing blunt trauma against plate armor. Use natural strength and the longbow's simple construction make high draws weights scalable with minimal risk of failure, and heavy arrows, thick ash oak shafts are practical because the bow's power can launch them effectively at close range. In contrast, the composite recurve's horn, sinew wood, laminated and shorter reflex limbs, say 4 or 5 feet, as also showed in the video, prioritize energy efficiency, achieving high arrow velocity, 170, 180 feet per second, with lighter arrows and lower draw weights. Scaling a recurve to 150 plus pounds is structurally challenging. Glue and materials risk delaminating under extreme tension, and historical recurves, such as, the Ottoman and the Mongol ones that are discussed in the video, rarely exceeded 100 pounds due to production complexity and material limits. Lighter arrows suit the recurve's design for speed and range, especially in mounted or long-range archery, not the close-range, high-impact volleys of European warfare. Right, so Easton is agreeing with this, regardless of maybe some number here and there. That's fine. I don't know, because this is not what the video is about, but in general, like to give a quantitative dimension of what we're talking about and why, in the sense, at a shorter range, the longbow can be more performing, especially equipped in an army with particular projectiles. So when you look at it, longbow's higher draw weight and heavy arrows were a deliberate choice to meet the tactical need for mass point-blank shooting against armored foes, leveraging use availability and simplicity for mass production, while the recurve's efficiency was less relevant in this context. So it wasn't built or used for heavy arrows. All right. So let's read how and why Easton sort of doesn't necessarily dismiss this notion, right? But he says at least there is a problem. He says there is a bit of a problem with this. Okay, first of all, longbows got really, really popular before really heavy armor was around. So this is what we were saying before. I disagree. I explained why. He, however, gives further insight, says, when these longbows started to become really prevalent in England and France, for example, people were just wearing mail. Not quite, right? First of all, as we said, like the 13th century, even in the first half, there is already plate around, all right? And it starts becoming really something also toward the end. So it's not even just about plate, it's also about the general armament of the men-at-arms. Easton knows this, right? And I don't know, as I said before, why he's sort of deciding to disconnect this chronological overlap, which in my eyes is frankly very, very clear. And he doubles down. It says, I'm literally reading from the script, so it says, they were just wearing mail. Okay, but as I explained, longbows were already around, and again, it doesn't seem to me that it's about quantity, really. In fact, he acknowledges that at least the premise is when these weapons were becoming more widespread, plate armor wasn't there yet, well, because he's maybe considering just the fuller plate armor of, I don't know, the second half of the 14th, the 15th century. I do not know. I just know that it's also pretty obvious in general that the longbow is sort of gaining momentum, starting with the same, plate gaining momentum. It didn't happen overnight. It was gradual. We don't even know fully and precisely the quantities, like how many archers did actually use the longbow, which also is, again, a pretty generic term. Again, made lots of videos, even one about probably later 13th century English infantry that sort of discusses this this aspect. I really can't further discuss. So he says, so you don't need super heavy bows in that case, because as many tests have shown, even 60 pounds draw weight long bows can put arrows through chainmail. Fine. We also actually know, and I'm sure Easton knows this, that, of course, like if you make a specific test, all right, in particular circumstances, you're not representing the whole, right, a picture that is happening on a battlefield. Most of these shots are going to, of course, to miss the target in general, but first of all, to simply not arrive at the right angle. They're going to be spent. Battles are messy. The entire focus on the battle is sort of volleys alternation rather than precision of the specific puncturing or blunt trauma goal, right, of on armor. So Easton says, okay, so you don't necessarily need really heavy arrows or really heavy bows in that period. Well, yeah, but in general, it's not even just the longbow that can do that, right? Also, the composite can do that, of course, but also smaller bows, simple wooden bows, which are, again, identical to the longbow, if not by size, can do that, right? This was always the case. So I could also give a more comprehensive general idea of how these things really go in parallel, but it's like with swords. Like, ideally, swords do not have to cut through armor and will not cut through armor most of the times. But as we said before, surprise, surprise, when plate armor sort of started spreading, also swords making tended to drive away from optimizing the cutting edge capacity, right? And so the general idea that I've also matured from warfare is that as long as there is a weapon, armor fundamentally stops that by essentially destroying the weapon but destroying the armor as well. And generally speaking, there is this sort of catching up of two elements, especially in this pre-industrial context when there is really not essentially a different material background. I mean, England and France during the 14th century were literally the same country in terms of material technological capacity. There was no difference whatsoever. So we can imagine things being very symmetrical, right? And that's something which I must say with a bit of, criticism to at least I see the people that I see gravitating around these communities and comments on the Facebook pages. It doesn't matter how many decades of such videos saying a bit all the same thing are made to explain how it should be done. There is always going to be the guy who comments, but given, what's in absolute terms the best armor, or if you take 100 soldiers equipped with this weapon or 100 soldiers equipped with, who actually wins? That ipso facto is the declaration of complete military historical illiteracy by any stretch that you can possibly imagine. I could digress on how things are tendentially symmetrical, but how warfare is by definition asymmetrical. What we're looking at here now, and here also the differences between not the weapons as such, but the way they were actually employed, is actually pretty low. And let's explain why. Or at least let's keep reading from Easton's script here. So later on, if we come forward to the 14th and 15th century, so he's literally here saying that basically before the 14th century, longbows had become prominent. But also, like by that stretch, again, in the 13th century, plate had become a thing, right? And if you really want to make it like all the possible scenarios, there are also shields. So it's not like we're looking at, there were obviously longbows. We've seen them, the Battle of Bourg-de-Rude, Anglo-Norman context, 12th century. Were there longbowmen? Yes. Were they effective? Yes, etc. But, is it just the bow performance that made that happen? Obviously not, right? It isn't just guys shooting at mail and see if it pierces through, right? Warfare is a bit more complicated. It's also difficult to translate this to absolute mathematical models because we just lack the actual figures of how many archers, what kind of bows, how many arrows, what happened during the battle. We do not know. We can eyeball that by studying battle after battle after battle and gaining confidence with the most important things that happen in battles. None of these sources actually cared that much about weapons, let's be honest. It was all about the alternation of battle lines, and we will talk about this now. But continuing later on, if we come forward to the 14th, 15th centuries, we do have this kind of super heavy armor period in Europe. Well, then we've got a problem as well, because do you know who really successfully used these bows? The Ottoman Turks, right? And who were the Ottoman Turks fighting against? The same European forces that these were being used against. So the exact same people who were being shot with these bows were also being shot with these bows. Here, I don't know whether the script was, because I simply pasted and copied it from the YouTube transcript. In any case, we understand here what the point is. So I heavily disagree with this, at least as a point or as a punchline, because he does not descend into the specificities. I think he goes a bit on with this, so we'll criticize it further. But the notion, right, that basically you can measure what happened between the Mongols or the Ottomans and the Westerners, right, on the battlefields of Central Eastern Europe, let's say pretend so to make an equation, right, from which you should say, well, look, the longbowmen in the West were defeated in a few battles. Here he talks about Nicopolis, for example. I remember if later here, but he mentions it before. The Crusaders, the Westerners, were defeated. So he doesn't make the point explicitly, but you see, he literally stated that, like, these guys from the other side use composites, and so what? So since they won the single battles, there are not even too many, telling you the truth, and also did not simply continue defeating Western forces just by puncturing them with their composites, by the way, because let's be honest here, of course, missile troops were inferior, secondary, light, infantry, and cavalry by definition. So obviously everything revolved more around the heavies, and in particular the combined tactics between the heavies and lights. This comparison does not really mean much, right? If you look at Mongol warfare, Ottoman warfare, they were similar as far as tactics employed. And what you realize how they won these battles was not about puncturing each other. It was about complexly sophisticated combined armed tactics enacted by the cooperation between different battle lines, flanks, refusing the center in particular for the Easterners, sort of refusing getting the flanks out of the way and then falling back on them on the flanks of the advancing Westerners, etc. So first of all, again, in all this, it's not like we hear, well, these guys won because they had allegedly better weapons. It's not really the point that by premise Easton was making, right? But here we hear basically, if these, longbows were so effective, why did, the Crusaders lost at Narva? And what the hell did that have to do with bows from both sides? That's a technologistic answer, and it's not even, of course, it's even without context, because it's not like we're looking at some abstract comparison there between a longbow or a composite. So I don't understand this point. They seem to me, again, not to hold much water, and I'm surprised because the same Eastern recognizes that this is sort of and he spends more time rejecting this opinion. At least he's not fully convinced about that, because he leaves the thing open, so he's honest and quite friendly, again, transparent with all. But it is obviously the most relevant question there. It does seem that longbows had, in particular, closer range, some very specific employment that we'll see now against more armored forces. I would like also to point out something in the bigger picture, and I really made lots of videos about this. The idea that Westerners were just being slapped by Eastern forces is here I don't really refer to Eastern, etc., but it's a sort of post-Vietnam syndrome delusion. All right, if you look at the entirety of medieval warfare, you realize that the Westerners had by far the edge by those time standards, which really means a lot from a military point of view. It's not like during the Crusades, since there were, horse archers from the other side, the Crusaders were doomed. There are even heavy knights pursuing this sort of Parthian-style shooting and withdrawing, that sense of, if not fleeing, horse archers, right? Even the most successful battles, like the ones of the Mongol invasion, that I would like to stress did not go anywhere, and later on you find the Khanate of Persia hiring Frankish knights, Italian crossbowmen, by the way, and the main Ottoman sort of battles against the Westerns. And if you study all the smaller clashes, there are instances of sort of the Westerners winning here, or losing there. So it's much less. You can't pick some, just like during the 100 Years' War. You mentioned those 3 battles, and everything seems like, oh my God, it all functioned in a very specifically categorical way. It didn't, right? But in strictly strategical terms, Clausewitzianly speaking, the fact of refusing the center, for example, as the Ottomans, the Mongols routinely did, against, by the way, the Westerners, because they didn't normally do it against each other, because otherwise, guess what? You don't even have the armies clashing, actually reveals a declaration of inferiority, right? If you have the strategic upper hand, the best thing you can do is mash the enemy in the face from the center. And this is exactly what the Westerners did, because guess what? They had the best cavalry, the best troops. And in order to sort of defeat them, you had to lure them in some sort of ambush. That naturally was very risky and difficult and complicated, and surely the Mongols and the Ottomans were good as they could, but because of reasons of leadership, of contingency, of different issues that if you study all these battles, you really makes you realize how the odds were very balanced, tendentially speaking. All right, this is true also for the French and the English during the 100 Years' War. There is no such thing like, okay, this army, even though the English were literally in terms of aforementioned material symmetry, technological symmetry, and numerical disparity, literally collecting the greatest series of victories in the entire annals of military history. In this sense, in these relative terms, you can't argue that the English armies of Edward III and his successors were really the best armies in history by that criterion, which is not absolute. It's, in fact, contextual, just to espouse also Easton's rightful sort of emphasis on the aspect. It's something that we should be a bit sort of more open to. Right, so in general, the fact that, say, the Crusaders were defeated at Nicopolis or Narva has virtually nothing to do with what kind of missile weapons or any other weapon, for that matter, were used. Right, war is primarily a clash between moral forces that reciprocally influence each other. These peoples, as sort of ethno-culturally different, they could be at war. They were also very, very similar. Right, compared to, I don't know, today's sort of level of, structural armored forces, industrial plants, sort of technological differences, the latter always being minimal anyway to the broader balance. It's always primarily about moral forces. It's not per se an indicator, again, of any specific issue with the longbow or with composite. Besides, leaving aside simple things like simple numbers, like, for example, it's not like the Genoese from the French side during the 100 Years' War ever seemed to have had the chance to have a sort of parity exchange with the English, right? At some point, if you look at Crécy, they may have been even, multiple times less than English longbow and having, a tougher ground, whatever. So you never even find that symmetry to begin with. And we also don't actually know what really happened, which is, unfortunately, I must say, as literally the guy who reconstructs battles for a living, what we have to at some point accept, right, as a limit of our own. How many were there, again, etc. All the range or how specific battle tactics were designed, mostly a shorter range, but also lower technical performance of the individual weapons, is something that we largely have no clear information, explicit evidence of. We can sort of eyeball that, again, but it's not something that you construct on the basis of sort of weapons performance as much as, battles, comparisons, and being very, very careful about what sources actually say. I made a video, for example, about the Battle of Poitiers of 1357 that honestly is one of the most beautiful battles that I've ever reconstructed, a masterpiece of the Black Prince. And it's really a video that I made it in a couple of videos, by the way. It lasts hours, right? But it's very meaningful because in that battle, you realize that basically there, whether the English had longbows or crossbows, basically it would have not made a difference. At least we don't have any evidence that these technological divides, even if we suppose them to be so, or different type of, aside from the fact that the Gascons mostly had also crossbows on their own, by the way, and we don't even know the quantities there. So we are at these levels, but you always find the parrot here. Again, I'm not talking about Eastern, but unfortunately, the typical population that can also watch my own, maybe not my own content, because I'm very, very harsh on this point, and that's maybe one of the reasons why I don't have as much following as Easterns. But in general, you will always find the parrot who says, but it's the longbow, right? So I will skip any other consideration, get the point, and you also get, in this sense, why I disagree with Easton here. Right, because it doesn't seem to me that the sort of counter-argument to what we illustrated before in terms of the actual armament and contingency holds much water. Then Easton goes further. And the thing, the reason why this video of his interests me that is he steps out in this other sort of art of war field as opposed to sort of individual apological aspects, right, and technological performance of the various weapons. He says, we can also, if you like, go all the way over to China. We can go to the Ming Dynasty in China. We find that there are types of Chinese bow which indeed are usually longer than this Turkish bow that he's handling in the video. The Turkish bows are particularly short, but they are nevertheless composite recurve bows, and they are shooting whooping great heavy arrows with anti-armor points on them. And yes, okay, they're training to shoot at faces, but they are nevertheless also designed to shoot at people with heavy armor on. This is also true, right? But tendentially, again, what we just pointed out, because of course there were all ranges of anti-armor Of course, points for also the composite, the typical horse archer as well. We documented it, for example, in Mongol warfare and all the archaeology or across some of the most remote and sort of forgotten places in the bowels of Asia, like Gog and Magog's home. But this does not mean that you're actually doing a great match with that. Of course, the archers in general are auxiliary forces, right? It's not like you take down knights by shooting at them with arrows as actual units or battle lines, all right? The knights are going to run over you, right? You don't stop cavalry charges with that. That's a myth, right? As we will understand now, the best you can do is to shatter their order. And longbow, in part, was designed to do that, as it was designed, as we'll see now. We'll understand also how and why the Turco-Mongols used the composite, say, nomads mostly did that as well. To make a long story short, there was much less wealth, and so troops were at large much less armored, and therefore they relied on these ranged weapons because literally it was their best defense. And again, ranged weapons do not make you win. They're not the decisive weapon in medieval warfare, all right? They will be later, of course, but again, by definition, if you use a ranged weapon, you're light, which means that a guy who is heavier can actually reach you and cut you down, right? And you have to get the hell out of the way if you want to survive. And this is exactly the bottom line of the story, that regardless of the anti-armor capacity of these weapons, battles were not won because of the preeminence of missile weapons at all, right? And Easton says, and they're shooting Whooping, okay, we've read this with heavy armor, so we find a lot of the same challenges that we have in 14th century Europe for the bow. Here, again, I would like to stress that but we will talk now a bit about the Chinese foot archers as well, because if I'm not wrong here, yeah, he goes on with that as well, because that's a sedentary context, but that's exactly why the comparison also here doesn't necessarily or properly work, to be honest, because again, you cannot compare a sedentary civilization or the degree of development of the West with, say, the Mongols or the Turks, right? You can make the case that yes, knew how to fight, as we've seen, they didn't overall differ enormously in performance in sort of an army's an army, right? But where did the Mongols or the Turks go compared to the Europeans? I mean, seriously. Right, Europe at this point had the highest per capita wealth in the world, had the heaviest armies out there. Europeans were covered in freaking metal, all right? They had much heavier troops, much bulkier forces, and again, in that sense, pretending to take them down with missiles doesn't make sense in general, because not even Europeans simply took each other out with missiles, right? Just a minimal fraction of, especially the men-at-arms, was taken down like that, right? Most people probably butchered down with swords, with maces, ran over by horses that, again, were not stopped by missile volleys. This is a complete myth. We know it pretty well. I mean, this is not a controversial thing. This is extensively documented, also from the poor scholarly sort of interest that exists on these topics. In general, it's definitional. There wouldn't be a difference between heavy and light in strategic terms, in tactical ones, of course, in this case, more specifically. And it's all about the combined arms here being used, not some sort of single arms used abstractly, like, I don't know, a horse archer against, a smashing knight charging him. Like, it's a completely different thing. And mostly, this is in fact the point, these types of arms tended to fight against their own kind, right? As we will see now, which also Easton knows, archers tended to first of all engage their own correspectives on the enemy wings that were also archers, just like the men-at-arms fought against men-at-arms. It was, if anything, like the combined action of the victorious wings, right, over their own correspectives, now falling on the enemy, the heavier flanks to make the thing, and or if, say, the center collapsed even before, just by the same pressure, the men-at-arms, the battle was won, and you didn't even really need missile, even though you kind of always needed them, because that's how tight these combined arm tactics actually were, and all the sort of the general ability in the art of war derived specifically from that. And not just that, because there were also multiple battle lines, and so, but let's not digress, because that's at least not too important here. So Easton says, you have exactly the same challenges in China, because you've got people in quite heavy levels of armor, and you've got bows and arrows up to counter those. So this is not entirely true, right? There is no evidence in late medieval warfare to say that on average Chinese infantry, or say heavies, because that's also the point, heavy cavalry, heavy infantry, were more armored than the Westerners. There's no evidence to support this, not generally speaking by the design of armor and the spread of metal and so on. The Chinese didn't have something like that. Everything was much more watered down. And it's not like they didn't have heavy armor, but it was sort of more diluted in a sense. It's also not strange that as a more sedentary people, they would use, for example, large amounts of infantry archers to counter, for example, with the same composite, the much more familiar and present steppe foes, right, that in the West we didn't really see that often, right? Another thing is Central Europe, Eastern Europe, which unsurprisingly actually, are also lighter than Western Europe in terms of general armament. And that's more like a political and social, it's a general issue that is also reflected in a military point, from a military point of view, and vice versa. And I don't think it requires much of another explanation. That's exactly how and why, again, in general, when you look at the Turco-Mongol military developments, you cannot claim that really the West was lagging behind them. And a defeat or two or even three across centuries in a broader international sense is not actually the measure of that. It's the indicator of some things going on in the respective military systems, but in general, it's something that we should treat a bit more carefully and in function of that. It's just like saying, I don't know, the Westerners had more spread firearms because of higher per capita wealth, or some more egalitarian societies. The Ottomans didn't have a really big deal. They had a lot of, for example, they didn't have a lot of pikemen, right? Like the pike squares of the Renaissance. They had a lot of shot, but primarily they stuck to archery, interestingly enough. But they had also monster artillery. At least certain muskets of theirs were apparently very precise, etc. But they were sort of more overall unique in the scene compared to the more homogeneous and uniform, tendentially uniform Western firepower, collective training, and so on. So we can look at individual capacities, arms, etc., say, okay, this looks cool, but is that the only indicator? No, it's part of a combined arm system that at the end of the day has a very specific outcome, and even beyond the strictly military dimension. So let's keep reading here. So Easton says, at this point you might be thinking, okay, Matt, you've just debunked, or at least attempted, I would say, to debunk all the main points why people say that these bows were more popular in England and France, for example, northwestern Europe, compared to these bows. It's what I was saying before, like at some point he says, also in Spain, maybe, in Spain, like the wide majority of the West, they even though adopted some longbows, imitating the English in many ways, but was going on with crossbows, right? So, and without too much of a problem, and without sort of staining the crossbowmen's reputation, even after the defeats, say, of the Genoese that were still, for example, always kept, well paid by the French afterward. This will have meant something, I believe. And Easton, this is to, like says, and yes, I have debunked them all. Well, I disagree, but nevertheless. So I have to come up with an answer, right? Yeah, so he comes up with his own answer to answer this question. So basically, again, why longbows, if recurves, are better? Why didn't medieval longbowmen switch to recurved bows, right? And so he says, well, first of all, I want to say I don't necessarily have all the answers, and this is something that actually renders him a great honor, right? I'm a much more arrogant person by nature, or at least I tend to be combatively aggressive in these things. So he says, I'm constantly trying to learn, theorize, and bounce off ideas of you guys as well. All right. So at this point, I welcome you to post down below. What do you think are the most important factors for why the English, the French, and let's face it, most Western Europeans prefer the simple wooden bows to these composite recurve bows, right? Even if on paper, scientifically, we know that these bows are better in a lot of ways, because you see, he actually has, the answer in his own words, like to these bows. So having said that, I don't necessarily know the answer. I'm going to give one possible answer. It comes down to how the bows are used, which of course approximates what the point here is. So he says, so you will notice that a lot of the places where these short composite recurve bows are used, they are used from mounted positions. Okay, not always. Obviously, they had foot archers as well, but very often these bows are used in hit-and-run tactics by mounted archers. Okay, by people who head right in, they shoot from as far away as they could. They had known, and they had, because here from the right off, and again, they'd move around somewhere else. And so they would harry the enemy constantly from distance. That is an entirely different use to these bows, which were almost entirely used on foot, right? But the question here, I think, in this answer, there is a major strategic sort of issue. Like, the question is, why did they fight, with those hit-and-run tactics, right? I answered before. Actually, we're not looking at a type of weapon that, in a type of context that secures an actual superiority, right? Actually, these short composite bows seem to be less impacting in a general sense. I mean, we've seen it, I don't know, look at the Battle of Dorylium, how you had these Crusader knights with all like their padded coat underneath their mail, like being all punctured by lots of Seljuk arrows, right? There you have a perfect depiction of the hail of arrows that these Easterners could throw at heavier armies Western armies that could simply also continue their path under this hail of arrows. We've seen it many times, right? And we've seen how this element alone not just was not decisive, we've seen it even in battles that eventually the Crusaders lost, like the Battle of Hattin, for example. It was completely normal to march, for example, during these hails of Saracen arrows, right? The point is that this was a declaration, also massacred an entire day of march under Turkic horse archery. Why? Because the Turks, in that sense, didn't have anything to stop the advance of that heavier force. It wasn't just like a trap, as it also almost succeeded, because at Massacred, it's not like the Byzantine army was simply routed as a whole. They managed even to come back to their camp, right, being still harassed. But even when the Turks sent in their heavy cavalry that was smaller in number, in this sense, not enough to break properly the heavy elements of mostly Byzantine infantry and cavalry in numerical order, you realize that this is just as a part of a military system, an actual handicap, right? Or at least it's a declaration of, okay, we don't work. We're not successful enough. Why? As we explained before, because the large masses of these steppe armies are constituted by pretty lame troops. Let's be honest. I mean, the average horse archer sucks in strictly military, even sort of some heavier in foot sergeant from the Western side is a more effective fighter at large than these guys, right? And they can have lots of these horse archers that will, in fact, not engage, if not against lighter troops as well, including each other. And one reason why these weapons were so ranged, in fact, is that these troops didn't have much protection at all. So they had to ideally shoot themselves at least to be minimally safe at distances where they could. Admittedly, the best also fence and defense was this concentrated arrow fire. So it's a bit like, 18th century warfare. Why the lines? Because, of course, that kind of fire at large was the only way by which you could be screened, could be defended by the enemy offense, right? In the steppes, it was basically in the same way. But the steppes were a sort of ghetto, right? They didn't have the critical mass to smash through Western, let's say in this case, Western civilization, sedentary civilizations. It partly happened, for example, with sort of more fragile oligarchies and hierarchies like China. And in what I was saying before, and it's not like China was overrun simply by the steppes, as you know. They were just ruled by dynasties and part of their military that came from the steppes, and eventually sort of signified once again. But the thing I was saying before, the fact that the West had more widespread protection as opposed to the Chinese in relation, that had a bit the same steps as a trajectory, like heavier elite and sort of more expandable, broken, sort of communitarily cohesive forces, unlike in the West, is the measure of this difference. Is the measure of why that breakthrough happened in China, for example, did not happen in Europe. All right, it's the biggest factor, and possibly just by alone the decisive one. Because it also entails all the others that can be there from a more strictly technical or material term. So I don't remember even how I arrived to this point, but I think it was very important to highlight the fact that we're not talking the same systems. The West is much more unique as a whole. This is not about the English and their very successful tactics during 100 Years' War that also owe much to the reforms of Edward III, also in the state, not just in the army. It has to do with specific leadership, with specific morale, with specific, even with luck, right? All the greatest victories in history can be achieved. This was also an imperial, traditional, Catholic dogma. You could not really win. Caesar literally created an entire religion around his own personal fortuna, luck. You cannot win without gambling, right? This is incredibly important, and all the greatest leaders were perfectly aware of this, right? This is why also such a radically, traumatically, and brutally underdeveloped people like the Mongols could take over China. It was a matter of moral force to some degree, and it's not like the Mongols even got civilized in the process. The Mongols remained Mongols, and the Chinese remained Chinese, regardless of the Mongol injections, so to say, into China. This is very, very important to stress, because this is exactly the same with the West, if not more. Right? The West had a massive edge in terms of sheer political, military, social force. I mean, Western forces alone themselves. I mean, we are impressed by the Ottoman advances, but why? Because simply the Westerners could even stop the Ottomans by being chronically divided, which is a massive overconfidence as a whole. The entire, here during the 14th and 15th century, economic spheres of general finances of Western Eurasia and the Mediterranean revolved around Italian banking alone, right? Including those people I've seen that commercialize longbow production to sell to England. And of course, in England, they would create their own longbows anyway as well. So let's evaluate this specific aspect. It's not just stick to the weapon, because it's not a good choice in order to explain this as a whole. Categorical note using horseback. Here he digresses, but I will read this from here till the end because it's more relevant. I have to make my points anyway at the beginning. In fact, Easton says there is a little bit of evidence. People like Mike Lodes and have come up with some interesting examples. Not all of them necessarily completely convincing, but nevertheless, there is perhaps some evidence, and there's certainly artistic evidence that longbows were sometimes used for murders. Oh, like that story. Well, yeah, I basically agree with Easton here. Like, yeah, of course it could be done, but in a functional sense, things were not. Again, people fixate with what can be done. Like, there were lots of things that were done at the time, like you can do today, like in a circus, like shooting, 5 arrows in a matter of seconds and hitting a small target. That has absolutely nothing to do with warfare, like zero, right? It's not like the same people weren't able to do that, but they had nothing to do with combat, right, in that circumstance. Combat is primarily about collective forces. It has completely different optic level training, sense of properly unitary action. This individual jests have nothing to do, again, with how battles were actually fought. And I want to stress that adverb very much. Easton says, however, by and at large, it's an infantry bow. Much like other longbows, like the ones used in India, were predominantly used on foot, whereas there were generally used or were bows chosen to be used on horseback or elephant back as well. But that aside, what that means that the archers are performing a slightly different role. They're more static. Okay, now, moreover, if we go to the 100 Years' War, where we have the best source material for these being used, there is an enormous amount of evidence, which I've talked about in previous video, and also we've talked about in videos I've done with Toby Capwell and Will Sherman and Todd and others from what I call flat shooting. Okay, he says, the okays are his. Mostly, because I also say that. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean in a nutshell is short distance pummeling. Okay, so these bows, these composite recurve bows, are perhaps most famous even in the modern world for flight archery, for sending arrows a long, long way. Okay, not to say that they can't be used flat shooting at close range, of course they can. However, it does seem that because of the nature of, because he's talking about composites here, of the nature of European warfare, these long bows, they went for the super heavy draw weights. It seems, from the nature of the bows, for example, recovered from the marrow rows, but also looking at the arrows and the arrowheads and the written sources, it seems that predominantly they were not sending arrows long distances and raining arrows down onto people from 250 yards away, which we could prove only if we had a recurve bow. We could hit them from 500 yards away potentially. Instead, the archery is done at almost point blank, shooting flat straight into the flanks of enemy forces, very often while they're engaged in hand-to-hand combat. So the standard English tactic of the 100 Years' War seemed to be to engage the opposing French or Spanish, sometimes Scottish forces on the front, and then have your archers on the flanks shooting to the sides of them to kettle them essentially, but obviously also wound them. So I will stop here for a while, because this is not just, and I specialize literally on this topic. By the way, my publishing has to do exactly with this, and I've complained endlessly, and I will not say who I am, what I'm publishing, etc., but I have consistently highlighted how international historiography has practically no idea of how most countries in the West work. This tactic was not just an English one. Every single Western army fought in the same identical way, especially from the 13th century. The level of homogeneity of these tactics was incredibly high. And therefore, there is nothing particularly special about these tactics at all. Meaning that, or at least they were special, and they were surely the product of the peak of medieval civilization, but they had nothing specifically to do just with England or with longbows. Plus, what here is not actually discussed, and I sort of take issue with some thing that is being said here regarding the fact that longbows were not thought to shoot at, say, 250 yards away, is the fact that it's not like the enemy was simply allowing your archers to outflank him, or to flank him to begin with. Armies at large were deployed with a certain width that remained the same, and the only way you could basically outflank the enemy, or flank the enemy to begin with, is, again, knocking out the enemy flanks as well. And at that point, having these wings closing, literally, and they are also missile troops. They don't really need a specific array at that point. They're not heavy infantry. It's enough for the outflanking, even by these light troops, to create a massive psychological damage. It's not even about shooting at that point at closer range. It was also done, but it was just the unoptimal situation in which those guys in the centers had gotten to begin with, and by far the greatest danger that they were encountering were the men-at-arms in the front. At that point, outflanked, there is no match, and so it's not much about the longbow, right, of anything. Also, when you have enemy wings, say better, in front of you, if these wings are made of, say, crossbowmen or other longbowmen at some point, you have to engage them in some way. So the notion, of course, they could change ammo with that, again, more sort of the longer range type of army. In fact, we know that that was the case. So here, Easton is basically saying, in my view, is just what we also said before, like these specific tactics in the West mostly were designed to shoot a close range, almost a point-blank range, right? And we'll go on. He says basically that the composites were mostly shot like in a more sort of markedly parabolical fashion. I actually disagree with this. There were plenty of contexts in which longbowmen and crossbowmen would have some more parabolic fire. They would also shoot at some point from hills. That vastly increase in that sense also the gravitational sort of acceleration of these projectiles onto the enemy and increased range. There are plenty of battles during the same years, by the way, by armies that were much bigger, much more collectively trained, even than the English ones of the 100 Years' War, that at large mostly got their victory from a desperate situation that was exemplifying their strategic inferiority, for which they had to, in fact, sort of bog themselves somewhere we could better defend on tougher terrain. There were normally fewer. There was nothing optimal about that, including the fact of dismounting their men-at-arms, which more ideally would have actually led a cavalry charge. Things were, of course, a bit more, for the English side, sort of habituating themselves to, especially with the refeudalization, the mid-14th century crisis, to also smaller armies. That's why terrain, for example, was more important at a point, and why men-at-arms also from the other side used to dismount. As we've seen, it's not like the French fought in particularly different ways for that matter. So there are a bit of myths that I'm sure also Easton is quite aware of, that level of the story, right? So, now, longbows were definitely employed also in a more preferential or at least mandatory fashion in engaging at hundreds of meters away. And the thing about flanking the enemy was also pretty standard in the moment in which you had the actual chance of doing so, which was not to be given for granted at all. And that was just a specific contingency of this or that battle that would allow, of course, and this is to be found in plenty of other sources across Western Europe. I documented many of them, also with crossbowmen doing the same identical thing, because guess what? Again, it has basically nothing to do with the weapon. If not, it's a missile one that they also engaged with, of course, in hand-to-hand combat for that matter. And that for that closer distance, of course, they wanted to maximize damage with, bulky, with the proper ammo that could allow to smash into also like plate, right? Given that this center is mostly constituted also by men-at-arms and other heavy troops. Now, you would say, but in this way you don't really answer also Easton's question, because, let's say, this question is not much why the Westerners stuck to the longbow, if you don't take into consideration the fact that they mostly stuck to the crossbow, telling the truth, which is also a very different thing, at least in technical terms, as the same Easton discussed, but as we've seen, it was not even a very tactical thing. The point, then this is my personal opinion, that studying these battles and looking how this warfare was really about, it seems that especially in the English case, that also happens to be sort of characterized by the longbow for reasons that I'm not even going to digress on, but I discussed another bit, like how did the English specifically came up with this, given that it was such a common weapon, also all over Europe anyway. The reasons may not even be that flattering, telling the truth. It may have simply been a social issue, right, that eventually was functionalized. But again, I'm not going to discuss this. It seems to me that especially when you look at the major English victories of the 100 Years' War, is that, of course, the main problem of these guys was stopping enemy advances, whether more typically mounted or also dismounted, like also in the same battles this could happen. Look at Azincourt, for example. And that had, in this regard, also at close range, because there weren't probably even much numbers to match the enemy one, so they had to desperately insist in this tight combined armed cooperation synergy to shoot like in very shocking trauma power fashion with very heavily loaded weapons against these advancing enemy formations. Why? Because if you shoot, the longbow does have the advantage that it can be reloaded faster than a crossbow. Again, also this factor is not that important. For example, the crossbow, generally speaking, this is also debated, but it's been discussed also by some scholars, has higher range. So what would be the bottom line? Higher range, you always win because the enemy doesn't even arrive to you. That's not the thing. That also is framed within the fact that, in fact, this absolutistic performances, technically speaking, had nothing to do with how battles were actually fought, and especially in collective training. Maybe in ambushes individual, you could find some kind of Rambo-style kind of performances, and we know that happens. That statistically, like the smaller the engagement, the more likely that is. But on bigger battlefields, at that point, what you really wanted was to harass an enemy, say, cavalry advancing, for hundreds of meters, by the way. So obviously, like in this sense, I don't think that what Easton says is specifically right, or at least is not specifically the answer to why did they stick to the longbow. It was not just because of the short range. They needed this thing to bombard with arrows this advancing cavalrymen. Because they knew that if they didn't disorder the enemy formation, they didn't damage it before they reached eventually the men-at-arms, because they reached them as an intact full formation, because as we explained, no missile formation disrupted heavy lines of cavalry and infantry at all, right? But could disorder them. And so if you are, again, a men-at-arms and you receive hundreds of longbow shots, most of them will actually do nothing to you, but some will damage you, also in a sort of significant physical. Everything can happen, physically speaking, splinters, whatever. But especially, you will be shattered by this consistent, sort of distracting, traumatic bombardment over you. And disorder, for example, your battle line prevent you from maintaining order within it. And you know how detrimental it is during an attack in particular, which is the more demanding aspect of warfare, to be correctly carried out as far as the order of the formation is, right? If you disorder the formation, you break its effectiveness, and you give the enemy a great edge once he receives you, all right? This is the actual reason. Because the longbow had, per se, this incredibly impacting capacity at closer ranges, also in the hundreds of meters, and also in the last 100, for example, and given its reload time, could intensify that in the moment. And so not much piercing armor, which could happen, but was not the immediate goal. The immediate goal was shattering the order, the psychology of the enemy battle lines before they reach your own heavies, that were the guys who made most of the work in all of this. And only second, and that was the main function, right? And it was not even to be given for granted that you would have succeeded at that point, because these heavies smashed in front of your heavies. And then there were wings that faced your own longbow wings that were normally, again, missiles or even heavies at some point, like as in Cour, but even on that occasion, for example, many people mention it as saying, oh, look, the longbowmen stopped cavalry. It seems that French cavalry in those flanks was incredibly disorderly, undisciplined, radically understrength. And longbowmen weren't just longbowmen. They were equipped at that point with swords, there were stakes, so it was something a bit different, and were surely also heavy infantrymen among them to a degree. We know at some point longbowmen wings were routed, and some troops even came back later. So there is nothing categorical, deterministic, technologistic, positivistic about any of this interpretation. And while I absolutely agree with Easton that longbow eventually was used also at that shorter range, also when during the moment of outflanking, literally like shooting a person 20 meters away or even less to maximize the impact, right? It was really devastating, especially on the, the horses' bellies that from the flank were not armored normally. Because everything was mostly about chest plates, chamfront, etc. Also for the heavier horses, mostly horses died in this kind of engagement. The same goes for battles fought entirely with crossbows. It's the same identical thing in terms of losses of horses, in terms of the thing with longbows. So there's nothing incredibly or specific about that, or even apparently slightly specific about this, and so the longbow, because we should, in order to answer this question, we're comparing the longbow with the composite as if there was nothing in between. And the crossbow still performs the same function. And yes, it's not a bow, it's a bow in the guise of a crossbow, but in this sense, it's also a different logic. And yet we don't see that much difference even in the final performance at the end of the day. So in order to answer this question, no, I would say that shooting at very short range was relatively secondary. Because in order to do so, you had to either be desperate, and admittedly it is true, especially the English in radical numerical inferiority at some point were, and so they were excellent also in standing their ground with enemies advanced at close range. But at the same time, it's completely normal in Western tactics for the same identical missile wings function to be performed. Right? Again, there is nothing specific here about English stuff. I know that probably, I don't know about Easton, that is a cultured person, but I've noticed throughout my entire YouTube several years long career, so that most people stop to a very specific Anglosphere set of bibliographical reference and literally know nothing about how also Western European countries at large fought, which in some cases were even more advanced than what was happening, say, during the 100 Years' War. So, again, no, I don't really believe that the narrative is we simply outflanked the French, the Spanish, and the Scots, and so that's why we needed to shoot a point-blank range at the shorter. No. All right? It was chiefly frontal, and then, again, for any other missile troop, like if you manage to outflank the enemy, at that point it's not even about what kind of troop you have. It's just about the psychological effect of outflanking. And at that point, you know that the enemy had basically already lost, regardless of what kind of weapon you used. And again, I have plenty of evidence of this for many other countries in the same exactly vastly and even better documented way, telling the truth, compared to the sources of the 100 Years' War. So Easton goes on, it says, also, of course, the armor is at its weakest on the sides, yes, but it's also what he said now, potentially on the back as well, and it's at its strongest rate on the front. So if you can't shoot into the sides of armored men, much better than shooting into the front. Yes, but again, this is not normally what happened on a battlefield. It normally happened if you had the chance of outflanking the enemy, which was definitely by definitive odd balancement was absolutely avoided, and you had to fight mostly through a frontal clash before getting there in a situation in which basically you were already favored. And so it doesn't seem to be the primary reason why the longbow in particular was there. And again, if you make the comparison with the crossbow, because the tactics were, and I can't stress it enough, exactly identical, this does not answer why the crossbows, the longbow in comparison to the composite. Right, here we're talking about probably two different things. The composite here was evidently not as performing. We explained it before, that's why I pointed out before, in terms of this incredible strain at close range with heavier weapons, because that's what in the steps they didn't need to do, given that they were mostly all light, right? So that's basically the reason. In this sense, the composite is actually not superior, even in tendentially or absolute terms, if we consider the fact that, as we just said, odds were relatively balanced. Western armies were actually superior to the Eastern ones. These steppes cultures were militarily inferior. And admittedly, Eastern, maybe I went off, say, slightly off track, because Eastern talked also about the Ottomans, the Mamluks. These were not nomads, right? But they still fought with large amounts of horse archers and composites. Composite bows anyway. So that's also the question, how or why? Because essentially the dynamics that here we described as a sort of spectrum fundamentally headed towards the direction we've seen also with the steppes as far as the Ottomans or the Mamluks were concerned. Right? There were lots of horse archers in Ottoman armies. Right? And by the way, I would like to point out that as I've also described in my videos about Ottoman armies, that while, of course, we also know them better at this point in history through Western sources, then naturally notice the exoticism. There was actually, this is better archaeologically documented, there was a lot of Western weaponry or European weaponry used by the Ottomans as well. Right? Think about the Romanians. Granted, the Balkans had historically been heavily influenced by the Turks, by the Mongols. By that point, he made videos about Eastern Balkan warfare. But in general, they were, for example, the Ottomans were much more sort of Western-looking compared to, I don't know, the Safavids of Persia, or the same Mamluks, or the Tatars, right, of Crimea. So they also fought in their armies. So that's also a point you could make. And so Easton says, so that being the case, we have to shoot a close range against flanked enemies. That what we want is the simple bow. No, this is not the answer. Because, again, medieval warfare has to do primarily like any type of warfare, and given the great European homogeneity at this point, including the ones even with Eurasian armies in general, you do not have simply, Englishmen walking around the edges of the enemy formation and shooting the enemy at close range from the flank. That's not what an enemy, by definition, allows you to do. And the fact that this produced itself on the battlefield it was just a consequence of a more symmetric clash where also the longbow was used pretty much like any bow, also, again, including a crossbow in Western tactics. So I disagree with the general answer here. I think it's fundamentally sort of too mechanistic and technologistic answer that overlooks the actual art of war and tactical practice of the year, quite honestly. I know I'm being harsh. I don't want to be... as I said before, I esteem Matt Easton for all his work. I think he's very competent in his field. But again, as I've come to experience in my life, like HEMA is... regardless also of all the art of war expertise, surely Easton, I remember him saying very sensible things in many videos about that too. It's not really conducive to that. It's really distant from that, and at large, it's a narrower standpoint, and it sort of, in this sense, I presume, even thinking about the possible sources that may have been used to build this conviction, essentially deriving from a sort of anecdotal collection of individual references in the sources, right? Or maybe, I don't know, very advanced studies, I don't know, about what kind of wounds people had and so on. But unfortunately, those are very punctiform when you look at the overall evidence that of the whole picture of a battle at that time. Unfortunately, we can't fully reconstruct, if not through the bigger picture. That speaks as of collective tactics, not a collective formation, combined arms tactics, and not really much of this. Again, the guy who jumps next to the guy who's turning the flank to him. That's not the thing. And again, wings did close themselves on the enemy flanks. We actually don't even have any actual evidence that the wings were ever predisposed, as some people say, to close the enemy inclined diagonally. That would have been suicidal against mostly symmetrical formations, like in the West you have, unless there is a significant, terrain feature, which normally is not where big, important battles are fought. So lots of things can happen, but you have to primarily, in fact, to prioritize the more practical aspect and the bigger picture, because that's where you basically resolve battles from. And so searching for the individual dimension can be very interesting, but it should not sort of provide this perspectival distortion regarding the bigger one, that is something that we specifically study from also much more sort of positively reconstructible sources, including literally how did these units interact with one another, not the individual guy with the individual weapon. All right. And again, for the rest, I'm a great admirer of Matt Easton. I used to watch his videos back in the day. I learned a lot from him, and I want only to compliment him. I'm just saying from my perspective, he asked, quote unquote, even though I'm not such now, as I just pointed out, I don't have the time to watch YouTube, even though I'm here. And I actually made an exception because of him. But I disagree, and it's absolutely normal. I'm sure at some point I said something here that was not right as well, that they can correct me out, so I don't have any problem. I hope I know he probably doesn't have this to listen to the whole video, but I'm not want to be especially of this kind. So Yeah, and Easton says what we actually need is a simple bow that we can produce in large numbers in high draw weights, and it can pour arrows in flight into the enemies. So, other point here, what does it mean exactly? That the longbow would be some sort of cheaper stuff compared, say, to composites? Do you think that, I don't know, the Turk or the average Mongol guy in the steppe actually spent so much about his... I mean, in relative terms to his lifestyle, indeed, his composite bow was incredibly costly, etc. And so we can think that it was the product of such sophistication. But say everybody used composites in the steppe. So, like, that's exactly, if we're making a point of being produced in large numbers, that's exactly what the entire Asia did. So it doesn't seem to me that this can be yet another point in favor of, we need to shoot a closer range, so it's just about the longer. No, right? At large, the weapon itself, as I said, is hundreds of meters in range and accurate and militarily expendable. So the fact that the composite is longer range, yes, does correspond to a different route, but it's not by scale something magnitudinally outperforming. So you can't say that, I don't know, even regarding its quality or number production, we're different, really, proportionally speaking, between, say, the Western Europe or the steppes. It doesn't seem really right. Easton goes on and says, so it's not a question of that would necessarily do that better than the recurve bow. The recurve bow could still do that, but you wouldn't really gain a lot from it. There's an awful lot more, and here he would have cracked in properly what we said before regarding the performance, because indeed the composite was more delicate. It could not simply shoot like a massive bolt to smash into plate armor. It was also rarer just out there in the steppes. It was calibrated for a different purpose. So I absolutely agree with Easton in general. Of course, it's obvious, but the factors and the general proportions here do not ring right in my ear. Then Easton says, there is an awful lot more resources and time and everything else into making these bows. And as we've seen in 1322, here, okay, well, it's just an example. Say, you could have imported Hungarian bows that are, you could have acquired the bows or made the bows because you were already making composite crossbows anyway. So we could have made these, but you don't need a superior range and distance because they weren't doing archery like that. Well, this is exactly the same point that you can extend as far as the self-bow, as far as the entire Europe was concerned. I mean, that's the same difference of why, Europeans always use the same identical type of bow, and in the steppes they use the composite. Yes, there were times in which, say, I don't know, even the Byzantines used, I don't know, in places like southern Italy, in parts like also the Slavic world, there was this, again, hybrid place, like, say, area where the composite was used at different points in history, but this also came from a heavy steppe influence and some sort of replica of steppe warfare, where the steppe did not exist. Also, the Ottomans exactly felt like that, in places that were not the steppe. But... right, so this also actually comes from the fact that, as we just said, there wasn't even this abyssal difference between these two weapons, right? It was just a general functionalization that you had to look at the extremes. But the extreme is that, again, in Europe, we made bows only and exclusively in the same identical way since, ever, right? And in the steppes, they created this other type. So to answer this question, we should go back millennia. I will avoid to do so because the video is very long as well, but we also described this in other videos. There are all the reasons in the world why that was the case, right? And it mostly is a political and social reason. It's not much, tactics make weapons, right? And not the other way around, if not by, 10%, all right? So the answer is, in this sense, and also the premises of the question are a bit too focusing evidently on the longbow maybe in a British perspective in this case. Well, it's not a problem really, but again, there is also another west of Europe that did not use the longbow, used the crossbow, for example. In that sense, by the way, the answer is a bit the same because the crossbow was evidently an anti-sort of heavier type of armor kind of weapon. And it hit horses hard, right, as well. And as we know, it's not like the Crusaders went to the Holy Land just to be slapped in the face by the Turks, right? They conquered the freaking place. So Again, any kind of general comparison should be done with sort of proper, again, diachronic and comparative perspective, and understood, in fact, in this broader picture, because there wasn't, again, anything even specific about how bows were used in the 14th or the 15th century, more than much, even compared to the previous centuries. Easton says that wasn't how they were using bows in Northwest Europe, also, again, because England happened to do so, and spreading that a little bit, especially in the 15th century, in places like France, Scotland, Burgundy. Yeah, but again, crossbow was dominant for the rest of Western Europe, and it's not like they were behind England. Actually, like, also things were to quite seclude the English, especially after the 100 Years' War, in terms of continental development compared to the continental world. And that admittedly is also because of other reasons that surpass the bow, right? But everywhere, so that's fair. But again, let's not presume that, again, the English victories of the 100 Years' War, doesn't matter how glorious they were, had to do with this overwhelming English particularism, right? They were sort of relatively conventional. They were just very well performed, right? And we do not really have an actual evidence that longbow dramatically improved this, right? We should rather ask ourselves why this choice was made at apparently almost national level and guided by the monarchy. And the answer is not much about the type of weapon, but the type of combined arm tactics, because especially infantry armies like, the Scots, the Flemish, the Swiss, didn't really have great range capacity. They didn't have a strong missile component. The English, yes, the English were all led in this sense by a monarchy that informed this tactic, this almost doctrinal choice. The Flemish, the Swiss didn't have a monarchy. The Scots did. Something you could barely call a monarchy was actually being established at that point in a more functional sense. And mostly they went to war with what they had. And actually the reason why the longbow also emerged in the English army is similar. But it was just further functionalized by a hell of a monarchy like the English one really was in a sort of happy moment of its political and institutional development. So Easton basically goes on and says they were using the longbows at the point-blank range, shooting at very short range, a heavy arrow. Again, this is not just the norm and justifying why the longbow was used. And again, it does not take into consideration the fact that the bigger crossbow in all of this compared to the composite. I made a video, by the way, about the early modern use of these kind of weapons, when they became gradually outdated depending on the times and the places, and I explained, even in part, these other topics. Easton says, and for that, this does the job, and it's cheaper, quicker, and easier to make. Again, I don't really see the comparison here in terms of, everybody in the step had a composite, and again, it's not like the English fought at short range from the enemy on a regular basis or just by tactics, by doctrine compared to other Westerners. That's not how battle tactics really worked. Again, outflanking the enemy is what everybody did, but before a conventional symmetrical range shooting of hundreds of meters away, right, or something like that, as also the enemy was advancing, as you could spend it with some of these weapons, not necessarily, again, at too long range. This is true also because arrows were not infinite, especially the ones who could make actual damage. So admittedly, yes, this is true that there was a closer range, but it wasn't the reason why primarily shooting at very close range the longbow was used. Otherwise, you can't explain why all the other Westerners used crossbows. And still, they were perfectly functional in their own regard. And Easton says, so I suspect that this argument is going to annoy some people like me, maybe. Not really, I'm joking. Because I think that what people like to hear is, they used X because X was better at a thing. Oh, well, absolutely. I loathe that thinking as well, and I hope that this video was also, it's paradoxically criticizing, the same frame here as if it was too much toward that direction. I don't know how much maybe this is, a homage to Easton's own followers, but it could be some, eco effect. If you hear people too much asking about this stuff, you tend to enter into that rhetoric. This may be a reason. If I were to search for my own bias here, maybe I'm underestimating this close range use. Maybe, but again, I watched enough battles to realize that we don't even have the indicators in sort of more collective terms that, I don't know, the English shot a shorter range in general, that the same reasons that would like to pierce armor to smash at enemy forces wouldn't be among the crossbowmen as well. So again, doesn't even here the comparison with the composite doesn't seem to me particularly convincing, as they used mass composite. Composite was even way more, in fact, universal in continents rather than sort of longbow, as we've seen, is basically prevalent / you could say virtually universal at some point in England just for a couple of centuries. So I honestly don't really even, I wouldn't force the particularism there, the exceptionalism. Easton says evolution doesn't always work like that. Things evolve to be good enough for the situation that they're required for. And the fact is that if the enemy is, here I'm just reading from the script that it may be messy because it's just like a speech, like mine here is much messier. If the enemies have long range recurve bows and are shooting volleys at you from 400 yards away, you have to have bows that you can respond with in kind. Otherwise, you just stand there and do nothing. Well, I actually disagree on this. As I said before, it's not like the enemy could simply... here we're talking about, again, the need to hit those armored opponents at close range because it was effective against plate. So why would, I don't know, being targeted 400 yards by a composite give you a negative edge? Obviously, the projectile at that point would have been spent. So even this comparison doesn't seem to me really fitting. Also, the horse archers of the steppes would have hit you at closer range. They actually used to do that very much, exactly in that hit-and-run tactics, because they were light and they could harass you at closer range. So again, I don't think this is true either. Then Easton says you have to come up with different tactics. Again, no, I don't think so. It's not like it's just like with crossbow. Also, crossbow seemingly had, not by too much, but a longer range than longbow. And overall, in strictly military terms, talking units, scholagladiatoria, was actually probably the superior weapon. And again, the English tactics have barely to do with the fact that the longbow was used as opposed to the crossbow. Especially the English victories had a few to do with that, because that's not how really warfare works. It's not technology, it's not what kind of weapon you use in that sense. You functionalize it, but the enemy also has normally something incredibly similar to you, especially if you are in the Middle Ages, right? And performances, as we've seen, are also relatively similar, are similar in scale, right? So the idea that the crossbows would win any battle because, they could shoot you and you couldn't reach the crossbow with the longbow. I've never seen this. Like, it's never stated by anyone. There is no evidence for it, whatever. Obviously, these weapons were used in very sort of more specific combat situations that were tailored to much more direct engagements. Equally, the horse archers of the steppes. It's not like the horse archer can shoot you from more 100 meters, that those arrows are going to do that much, especially if you are covered in armor. They're just going to bounce on you. They're not. That's why you were armored in the first place. And also, by the way, with something that was much more impacting in a shorter range, if this is exactly why the longbow was there. So what do you think that the composite bow hit at that distance would do to you? I mean, this is real, right? This is not a joke or a rhetorical... I mean, it's a rhetorical question, but it's literally it. Physically speaking, at that point, you can't be pierced. You can't be significantly wounded by that. And we know, again, it's plenty of evidence showing how Western armies were at some point under massive showers of arrows, and they sort of came out relatively unscathed from that, right? From these battles, we're not told that bows were particularly... On the contrary, we'll tell you something that here is very specific. At the battles of, say, Nicopolis, Varna, the general... also the ones of the Mongols... of the 13th century in Europe, what did the Mongols do? They outflanked you. surprise, surprise, the Mongols needed to outflank you to shoot on the uncovered part. They were doing the same identical thing that you're claiming here was the specificity of the longbow, which, again, was not specific about it, nor in relative nor in absolute terms. It's literally the same thing that you said, like attacking from the flank. That's literally what the Mongols, the Turks, did. They lured you, and they refused the center. In that, they distanced the wings, and then they came back on your flanks to target you from the flank. All right, so it's the same identical thing that you would hopefully do in a sedentary context with foot archers. You said it yourself. And so Easton continues, it says, if your enemies aren't doing that, if that's not how they fight, you don't need that weapon. Again, no, the weapons were used at also hundreds of meters away, especially if you were also facing crossbowmen. Again, there is not that asymmetry. All right, that doesn't happen. Just like you don't simply flank an enemy formation. Easton says, so my argument would be that the English didn't need this type of bow. Well, again, that's not it. It's about power. It's just like why the crossbow was around. It was to actually target heavier enemies. That's the reason why. If they had, I don't know, lighter enemies to attack, they probably would have invented something more longer range, or at least something that was more frequently used at longer range. That's why. And the reason why peoples were lighter in the steppe is mostly social. Again, it has to do with the resources, distribution, wealth. That's more or less the dynamic, all right? Easton says by the time, ironically, that they started to encounter people who did use these recurve bows more regularly, they had guns. But we actually know, I add, as Schwerpunkt, that those peoples from the steppes were actually taking blows from Westerners. I mean, the Italians in the Black Sea were the superior force, all right, against the Tartars of the steppes. It's not like the guys with crossbow, that was, again, more range, but not as range as the composite bow, had it worse than these other guys. All right, that's not the thing, right? So it was actually not even firearms that solved the problem. Actually, what destroyed steppes peoples was pike and shot warfare, right? Which was an unsolvable tactical puzzle, and that sort of made them crumble. It's not like even these guys disappeared all of the sudden, by the way. So if you had more powerful weapons like guns, it doesn't even mean that you get immediately that edge right off the bat. I mean, Easton knows this, but again, here this comparison I don't think is appropriate. Then Easton says, so you had a different answer to the problem, but in the late medieval, early Renaissance periods, the people that the English and French were fighting were largely the English and the French and the Scottish and the Irish and the Spanish, but this sort of Northwest European sphere. And if you're coming up against, again, I made the example of the Italians, fully Western in military outlook, they were fighting in the Black Sea with crossbows against the Tatars. So, again, it doesn't mean much, right? And it depends how you fight. Again, the Italians were fighting like that because they were also very rich, very armored. Again, they had the best arms and armor out there. And they weren't like the average Balkan guy fighting against the Ottomans, that as a Balkan guy was normally lighter, poorer, and therefore maybe more in need of that hit-and-run tactics already on its own, right? That's the actual reason. It's not because, there are these guys who are fighting in different ways. They meet, and so they have to, it's about range now. There are specific reasons why they fought in that way, and there are reasons that were complementary in the millennia. They were balancing each other out. They developed even up to the Atlantic with the same kind of logic. I don't know, somebody was fighting in the steppe because these people were clashing against one another for a very long time. And yes, there were poor worlds. They were, very sort of brutal and everything. But in general, like, they were also very sophisticated when it came to things like warfare and many other things. So again, I don't get it. It's not a matter of influence, of mechanistic imitation or osmosis, or as if these cultures came out just by a standard pack on their own, and then just when they met that there were issues. The gradation was complete at a political, social, military level, and again, it's not like the composite was coming from a superior military culture to the West. Quite the opposite. And in fact, at large, probably was even the worst weapon. given that you're going out there fighting better armored if you're a European in comparison. And in any case, the 1 versus 1 does not make any sense. Often favoring the Westerners even there because, they were also more qualitatively fewer in a sense, and they could withstand as much as the elite of the steppes was very, very elite. And there wasn't much in between because most of the horse archers and these swarms of them were mostly subjected peoples that were broken and poor because they had been conquered by those heavier clans that used shock tactics. They used the bow, but primarily they were actually smashing and were superior in that sense over these other horse archery guys. So again, it's important to get this. Really, really, really important because it's literally the ABC of Eurasian warfare that past millennia. So Easton says, and if you're coming up against opponents who primarily got crossbows and heavy armor and other longbows, you don't need a recurve bow. And why? Because you made sort of a bit like the opposite sense, because crossbows, again, it's not like they're less ranged than longbows, and actually you should worry about that. You don't need to outrange them. Easton says, well, it depends. I mean, at least even assuming that you balance each other up, yes, you're saying that basically they fight in a symmetrical sense. Yes, we need that. But at this point, you're also saying that they're not fighting at close range. Or at least they, again, in that parity way, they engage wherever they engage, but they're not simply outflanking them for closer range. So of the two, you have to choose which one, right? It can't be both because you're literally given an answer that is, has to be supposedly unitary in this regard. And Eaton says, and to overcome the armor, what you want to be doing is flat shooting at very, very, very close range. And again, I add that it wasn't much about overcome armor. It was about shattering the order of a unit, which largely did not pass through any significant carnage of the guys inside the tin cans, all right? It was mostly about disordering them because missile troops are auxiliary forces. They're light troops. They're subordinated. In other words, they're inferior to heavies, right? And this is definitional, so which it means that you are not actually using these archers to kill the men-at-arms. You're using these archers to overwhelm the men-at-arms and combine arms with your men-at-arms in a combined arm tactics, and largely sort of exploiting, of course, a moment of enemy inferiority. If you manage to outflank it for some reason, you have to really pray God for, and it is definitely not normal per se, because at that point you can do damage even if you threw stones at them, or simply engage also into hand-to-hand combat, which also happened. And if you had a recurve bow there, it would have also worked to some extent, right? And in fact, when here Easton says you don't need a recurve bow, why? You could need that as well. I mean, it would do that as well. It's not like it doesn't work in that situation. I mean, we're talking medieval bows. It's not like this prevented from actually inflicting significant damage to armor. We said it even before. You said that the Ottomans overcame the Westerners, implying somehow that the reason why in that occasion the Westerners were probably having difficulties was that they were meeting guys with that bow. So which one is it? And of course you could say, for example, that horse was not often armored, so that's also another point. But this is it. Also on Western battlefields, we have no evidence whatsoever of a cavalry charge halted by longbow shots or crossbow shot. It does not exist. It's always in combined arms with infantry. You have at most, I recently written about a battle where there was infantry and cavalry at the at the gates of a camp, and there were on the ramparts of this camp some crossbows, and the enemy knights crossbowmen. The enemy knights did not charge these guys, also because of there was the shots. But if they had from the ramparts, but if there hadn't been their own cavalry and infantry to back the crossbowmen, those knights would have entered and cut those crossbowmen to pieces, right? So this is very basic and conventional, and that's how essentially Western warfare worked, right? It's not even that different from Eastern warfare at all, right? The essentials are literally the same. In a sense, even in a mounted fashion, the steppe elite and the steppe horse archers work in very similar ways with one another. Literally, like the wings are composed by the archers, the center is composed by heavy cavalry. It's the same thing, right? So Easton says, and of course, like if you look at the 13th century, knights were sided mostly by infantry wings on the flanks, right? So the fact that the English eventually dismounted usually during the Hundred Years' War is not even just the most obvious reason. It's not like you can simply shoot, for example, knights from the flank all the time. Yes, if they're engaged against other knights in the same way we said before from the flanks, that's correct, but not necessarily because that's a normal situation for the knights involved. They usually, by the way, kept on fighting as long as to the point they were overwhelmed from the flanks, because they could still break through. And at that point, those missiles would have nothing else to do but to flee and to run pretty fast away from the corridor in which the battle lines normally clashed. So let's not overestimate light troops, because there is a reason why we call them light. And, that is not how they are armored, but how, also they can be, but it refers specifically to the fact that whether they can hold the ground against another unit or not. And that's what, in relative terms, makes it a heavy or a light one, all right? Ultra heavy infantry, 3rd millennium BC Egypt was a guy with an axe and a shield. Not even armor, right? So you tell me. So Easton says, what do you reckon, folks? Am I massively wide of off the mark, or have I hit the target exactly in the bullseye? I don't know. I honestly don't know. This is conjecture. And again, this is incredibly honorable from Easton. I admire him from this. He's a very honest guy. I won't say humble, because I don't think this is being humble per se. This is just being fair, all right? And I like people like this really much. I just, again, disagree, and I hope this video, if ever is going to be watched by anyone also who follows scholagladiatoria, etc., can help somehow. Easton says, I just do think that the standard response is an answer for why the English and the French and people like us, people like us, use these and didn't use these. They don't really hold water. They don't make sense. We have to come at this. This is exactly the point of my reaction, honestly, and it's maybe just taken a bit more of ahead in a, as we've seen, broader range fashion, so to say. Easton says, we have to come at this from a different point of view, a more holistic point of view. Exactly what I'm saying. Look at warfare as a whole. Exactly what I'm saying. Realize that arms and armor develop for fight specific enemies. That's where I disagree. There is some basic standard of how things work in the art of war across continents. Civilizations are not isolated. It's not much about, say, meeting one another, being influenced by one another, but just for the type of weapon that can be copied or not. It has to do with the intrinsic dynamics of how those communities work to begin with, even beyond warfare. And Easton says, and very often when a military force gets completely screwed, it's because they come up against a force that they've never had to deal with that before. So why not the Ottomans and the Mongols, if they were so good at defeating the Westerners, which was not even really the case, aside from some important battles, but not the whole picture, really. Why does it have to hold? It seems like... you see, an isolationistic idea. Maybe that's a British perspective, works like that in an insular way, I don't know. But the proactive forces here were actually the Westerners, in comparison. Easton says, now, look at the Mongols. Why were the Mongols so successful when they came into Europe? Well, you just said that they had difficulties with guys they had never fought with. And so why should they have not been the bad ones? And it's not like they even conquered Europe. They probably didn't even try to realize that it would have not made it. I made an entire video explaining why, and I also made an entire video explaining how the Westerners, just after the shock of those early 13th century years, actually quickly normalized Mongol warfare, and they even overcame it in a far and wide. Again, as we were saying before, the same Mongols came to ask for Western troops at some point, and I really don't think that the Mongols had sort of better To answer the question, of course, they were led by very great commanders. They were very well organized. They knew how to fight. They had subjugated lots of other peoples. There is a religious, spiritual, moral reason why they sprang out of the steppes just in that moment. They had also their school in the previous years, made lots of videos about Central Asian warfare, also in pre-King Gizit times. So that's very important. It's a bit like, why did the Romans take everything over, right? These questions cannot be explained in a mechanistic sense. It has to do with a moral dimension. But again, it's not like the Mongols went really that far, right? And again, the Mongolians remained what they had historically been without much of a chance. Do you think that Westerners were inferior to the Mongols or particularly impressed simply by the type of tactics used? If you look at the tactics of Western Mongol battles, you realize that the Europeans were crushingly defeated, but that their tactics were complementary. We explained that before, right? The Mongols needed to refuse their center in order to cope with Western heavy cavalry. It's not like they had all the jollies to win the battle just because they were the Mongols were fighting that way. There wasn't really a great divide between the two at all, right? You can see it in a more political, moral, cultural lens. It's not really the fact that these armies were dramatically asymmetric, for which, now every time they had to fight in that way, they had. Again, the English and the French armies of the 100 Years' War, they were literally the same thing. I mean, I made entire hours of videos on these topics in depth, and that's, you see, I understand it's the easy answer, because if you stress that, it's as if, there is a great asymmetry, then things have to tilt in a direction or another. And the point is that there wasn't that great of an asymmetry, and so the thing is subtler than it seems. And battles can be won or lost also by, you see, there aren't standard armies. They're always fighting in a way or another. They can't be even doing so in terms of tactical modules, but they are not necessarily always of the same quality. There may be all reasons for which they will misfunction. And Easton says, and swept everything before Lenin, like with no easy explanation of why, and that's why the big question. I'm not suggesting it's purely down to the bows. Oh, well, okay, that's also fair. I hope it would be the case, and I knew it would be the case, of course. I know from Easton's work that he knows this. But this is what happens when you encounter foreign technology. No. Again, I heavily disagree with this. That's not it. It has nothing to do with technology, largely. Like, technology here is like maybe working for a 20th of the world quantities that are working on that battlefield. It has barely anything to do with a 50% plus one. It has not to do with that, and this is a resounding no. And I've never really considered it as a matter of opinion, right? Because I think that the art of war is pretty clear about that. Then Easton says, and of course, during the age of colonialism, when European forces like the British, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, and so on, when they went to new places, not to say that those places didn't have effective weapons and arms and armor for all the fighting they had never done before, but suddenly this new enemy turns up with new types of ship or new types of gun or new types of sword or whatever, and then you're kind of screwed until you've managed to catch up with the new problem. There is a bigger gap, and it is absolutely true. Armies always adapt. But again, to suggest that there was this massive technological gap between steppes, peoples, Europeans, Chinese, no, right? They were all proceeding very much in tandem. And it's not like, peoples in Central Africa, in the Americas, etc., suddenly began to use, maybe single weapons, yes, but the entire, production system or the capacity to drill, the same linear format of, they didn't have that. All right, and they wouldn't have it until they were subjugated. Most of the times there was not much of a match. But why? Was it a matter of technique? It was a matter of power, really, and how to use it. And there are also lots of instances where these, very advanced modern European armies were soundly crushed in the 18th century. You didn't want to simply venture into the jungles, into far away. It was also a matter of logistics. It was a matter of, I think it's all about strategy. Telling you logistics is overrated. But this is exactly the point that I'm making, right? It's again, I don't think this transformation accounts for the main factor here for the subject of this video. It's just like, again, the French with the English. Did they, yes, at some point they used longbows themselves, but was it the game changer? Not really. Did, I don't know, other peoples use, because again, Europeans were all high. You found soldiers of all nationalities during the 100 Years' War. And it's not like, again, in the majority of Europe, the crossbow was supplanted by the longbow. Not even in the French army at large. So it's, I think it's really relevant to an important degree. To understand how or why these things worked and how they could be replicated. It surely happened, but everything is much more homogeneous than it actually seems, right? But this was a fair point. I mean, the fact that there is some important transformation, there is at some point, I don't know, a greater spread of the longbow in certain specialistic units towards, say, the 15th century in Europe, before eventually gunpowder sort of took over, etc. But in fact, it's also a difficult time in which to measure quantities per se. You can look at the Scots in the French armies that were fighting a bit like the English themselves. There you should dig into why also they were equipped already like that, rather than simply adapting to what the French had suffered against the English. Again, the French kept using the Genoese as well. How is that? Again, everything is really... also exchangeable in this context. There isn't really a cutting-edge technology here that is transforming the entire world. It's not really, not even firearms were actually really taken, but in fact, half of a millennium before supplanting definitely melee weapons and still maintaining some level of melee, by the way. So it's all very, especially the earlier in time, it's all very much more shaded and gradual. And Easton says, I think this operated fantastically for how they were used. The longbows operated fantastically for how they were used. This is also a fair point. I simply didn't really need the advantages that the recurve bow, composite recurve bow offers within the context of the warfare that was happening, for example, in the 100 Years' War. Yes, provided that it wasn't that unique. It was basically Western warfare at large. And so, again, something that is importantly different from a sedentary civilization, a urbanized one, a massively commercial one, but compared to the steppes, it's basically pure brutality to a large extent. Admittedly, it's not just the steppes. I recognize this. You talk also about the Ottomans, the Mamluks, but again, civilizational issues, like you realize the states were less solid than the Western monarchies to an important degree. They were more blurred. There were all cultural reasons. We could digress on it, right? Easton says, have I missed something massive? Have I missed a gaping obvious reason? You see, this question suggests some sort of technical thing, but it's exactly what Easton said before. He is perfectly aware that there is a bigger picture. And so I don't think this video of mine, if ever watched by him, will come as a surprise. Easton says, you remember those previous ones I listed before? I don't really believe that they hold water, but maybe you do. Make your argument down below. I'm very interested to see your comments on this, and don't get annoyed. Treat this as an open debate, because that's what I want this to be. I want to try and come to some answers. This is not about me being right and someone else being wrong. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will, of course, continue, etc., etc. And so here he salutes us, and we thank him for his work again. And this thing, it's unfortunately, I think it is about being right or wrong. I try to be right. I'm honest about this, but it's not like I'm trying to be right because I want other people to say, oh my God, look at that guy, he really knows the deal. Maybe flattering, maybe, I don't know, make me earn something, but it's not really, I think that if it works, it makes the world where I live better. And so that's why I think that if you want to find out things, I understand that this is said in a playful fashion. This is not about being me right, being wrong. He comes off, again, quite humble and respectful. But it's important when to think about these questions, trying to answer them, to sort of see that there is some sort of overarching point that is, in fact, more obvious than the technicalities of the weapons. And this is my general criticism, again, unfortunately, with my experience with HEMA. In here, it's 50-50, like some of that. And it's sometimes, I understand that, I don't know, I'm a guy who, it's not much like I also publish so much. I researched about battles, reconstructed them, trying to give the actual answer about what actually happened. Like, because when you have to publish, like, how did a battle go, and you have to answer that, there is no, you're faced with the inconsistencies that you can't overcome. Thus, you can't pretend, like, to say, maybe we don't know. That simply means that we really don't know, but you could know that, and that's what I like to do. And that's why I also have this type of content online that unfortunately doesn't get properly considered because it's too demanding in many ways and etc. But I think it's the most important, it's the fun here. And having made for several years videos about how basically every army in Middle Ages worked almost, we're still very far from that, but mostly having done this day after day, I think that, when I'm answering these questions, you see, it's as if there were a light that switched on, because I know the answer. I see it. I've seen it before. I can track it. I can see the pattern. I'm convinced about that. It's not like I'm making hypotheses. And again, I hope it doesn't sound arrogant. It's just like, look, this is the answer. We know it. We shouldn't really bother ourselves with too much overthinking. Like, you can get there. And I'm sure, again, that Matt Easton will surely get something from this if he ever watches the video. Again, I'm not asking for that. I make these videos just to get, I say, more views because people click on this, not generally the fans of the fan base of the other channels, because those tend to always be the fans. If it's not here about scholagladiatoria, that never happened actually before, but you always have these people who try to sort of say, oh no, you're not a true expert, you don't cite sources, what will this kind of... I don't give a damn about what you think. That's the first and most important thing. If you want to understand, well, otherwise I don't give a damn. So I thank Matt Easton for the beautiful video and for offering like this moment of reflection, of discussion. And so again, it's one of the few YouTubers that I really appreciate under sort of the military historical side of the story. I learned really a lot from him, especially about arms and armor. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.